Today, as a nation, we reflect on Brother George most times when we think we're in a peril as a community or as a nation going forward, or as a country not knowing exactly what direction we are taking. But most times George Odlum comes to mind. I think of the education factor, and I think of the bringing the journey of what made us the society we were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What made us literary giants, cultural icons. How did we produce these men like George? What is it we're doing as a society to sustain that kind of eloquence, that kind of educational standard, that kind of levity, that today we could say, are we a great nation, When I think of George and the educational factor, the fact that we're a nation who speak as badly as we speak for no reason, because we're supposed to be a very educated St. Lucia. I remember George when I see that even our language, Lang Mamano, our Creole, is being passed on as if it's just something we adopted, instead of a language that made us and was part of our journey. I remember, George, when we compromise on educating ourselves and educating our children, that we become a nation of compromising on talents, compromising on values, compromising on our civil duty. When we remember George, you don't just remember a revolutionary, or you don't just remember the revolution, but what came with it. There was a social factor, there was a political factor, and definitely there was an educational factor. And those people who were educated by this man at the time, it's still indelible in their mind, and he lives on. This is why we are here. And this is why we are here, to build a better society, to look forward to better politicians coming, to look forward to our better sports personalities, better cultural icons, and to build a better nation, that we would be as proud as George was, and as proud as the upcoming youth, as proud as we were of George, that we could be of them. So tonight, I want to thank you again for coming. And George's memory is so multifaceted that I'm waiting with bated breath to hear Earl, because I know that part of George as a writer, as a publisher, as an owner of a printry, owner of a newspaper, that he had that mark on Earl and many journalists, which now we are seeing that journalists come from the cracks, and maybe they should look back at that process that brought Earl and some of the other writers I see there, like Dave, like Mr. Huntley, to the fore. So, I'm very interested. I want to see that tonight we leave here edified. So once again, let me thank you. Let me thank all aspects of society who are here today. I hope we could have that impact on the youth too. Take this kind of documentary and make it an educational paper.
Folks, I want to let you know that this is going to be a long ride. I'm not a lecturer. And we cannot cover 84 years of George's life, or the at least 10 years that I spent working alongside with him, in 10 minutes. So bear with me. I'm sure that at the end of this evening, we'll either be glad I'm finished, or we'll be glad that I did it. Tonight, thanks to the George Odlum Remembrance Celebration Committee and the Odlum family, I have the rare distinct honor of delivering the 4th George Odlum Memorial Lecture. I am not a lecturer, but like George, I too like to talk and write, and I do try to tell a good story. Today being World Food Day, October 16th, I will therefore invite you to feast with me tonight on a full buffet of George's food for thought. We knew George the literati, the philosopher, the supreme orator, the regional public servant, the radical political activist, the mobilizer, the trade unionist, the cabinet minister, the diplomat, and most of all, George the politician. Tonight, let's look at another George, the crusading George, George the writer, the editor, and the publisher. Let's take that journey through Brother George's food for thought as transmitted to us over the years, from his brain to his pen to whatever piece of paper to the printing press, then into our hands and through our eyes to our brains every Saturday in the Crusader. Join me for the ride and I guarantee you we'll have a bon voyage. Part 1, the Crusaders. The writer in George could be seen and read in many parts: the playwright, the poet, the speechwriter, the pusher of pens on so many fronts over time. He was often described as a political journalist, but I must say I never heard George describe himself as such. He'd clarify that he was a politician who used his writing skills to publish a newspaper committed to the struggle. But he'd also tell you that he was not a journalist in the full sense of the word because, essentially, he did not earn his daily bread writing articles or stories, which is what reporters and journalists do. George was, however, absolutely clear about what he saw as the Crusaders' prime mission when he took it over in 1970. In his first editorial headlined "The Crusader," appropriately, he recalled the role of the first Crusader, and here we talk about John Humberton Pilgrim, the owner and pioneer who established the first Crusader newspaper. And George wrote, and I quote, of Pilgrim, "His was the painful task of molding public opinion and cherishing the virtues of democracy and freedom of expression. Truth was his obsession." George then described the role and tasks of the Crusader under his watch by his pen, noting that the Crusader had, by his words, enjoyed a noble privilege and its lineage is rooted in values and virtues that can stand the test of time. According to George, the Pilgrim torch has now been passed on to a new generation of Crusaders. These Crusaders will dedicate themselves to stimulating public opinion and encouraging open debate on all issues affecting the welfare and development of the people of St. Lucia and the Caribbean. The Crusader will seek to turn the spotlight on issues which affect the people of St. Lucia. The articulation of opinions and views is vital to the growth of a balanced society. The Crusader will therefore provide a medium for the forthright critical opinion from all persons and institutions in St. Lucia. It will endeavor to describe constructively problems of the society in a way which should assist legislators and government officials in finding guidelines and possible solutions to some of these problems. In this way, it will aspire to linking the gap between those who govern and those who are governed. The Crusader joins hands with the people of St. Lucia in building the new St. Lucia. That was George in 1970. Let's now look at George the writer from a journalistic perspective of what he described 14 years later as, and I quote him, "the thankless world of political journalism," end of quote, and he did so in his tribute to John Pilgrim in a Crusader editorial of November 24, 1984, and it was appropriately entitled John Humberton Pilgrim, born 1886 and died in 1984, and George noted here, he served St. Lucia and paid the price. So now let's look at the very first Crusader. So who was John H. Pilgrim? Who was the very first Crusader and who founded the first Crusader newspaper? Born in Grenada in 1886, Mr. Pilgrim was a West Indian at heart who made St. Lucia his home and played a major role in pioneering several lasting local institutions. He was a founder of the St. Lucia Cooperative Bank, the first indigenous bank, now known as First National Bank. Whose president is here, along with some other directors, Mr. Nigel Fulgence. Welcome to our presentation tonight. He was also a founder of the island's first trade union, the St. Lucia Workers' Union, a founder of the St. Lucia Manufacturers Association, the first president of the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, one of the two parties that merged to establish the United Workers' Party, UWP, in 1964, and he was also a councillor on the Castries Town Board, the predecessor of the Castries City Council and the Castries Constituencies Council as we know them today. But in all of that, like his successor George W. Odlum, John H. Pilgrim's first love was journalism in the cause of people's causes, crusading for what mattered to ordinary people. Pilgrim strongly opposed the colonial policy that prescribed that only people with property could vote in St. Lucia, as that outlawed the black majority. He also strongly supported Marcus Garvey's call for African descendants across the world to learn our history and know our place in this world. So let's now look at the first Crusader, but this time the first Crusader newspaper. To better understand the Crusader as we knew it under George Odlum, let's look at the first Crusader newspaper that later metamorphosed into what we knew. In an editorial tribute to Pilgrim when he died in 1984, George noted that when Pilgrim embarked on his journalistic career in 1934, according to George, he was clear in his objectives as he chose for the paper's motto the Latin words Veritas omnia vincit, meaning truth conquers all. In the very first issue of what was called the West Indian Crusader, that was the name of the first Crusader. The West Indian Crusader, and its first issue was published on Monday, the 1st of January, 1934. And in that first issue, Pilgrim declared the paper's first mission statement this way, and I quote, "The honest journalist needs not shrink from his public duty, fearlessly to proclaim the truth, to denounce fraud and imposture, to record faithfully as a mirror the fleeting pageant of the passing hour." End of quote. And it continued, "Our political mission will be to do all in our power to crush the pernicious system of crown colony government, that it may perish from the earth. But nevertheless, and I repeat, but nevertheless, we shall be mindful before we destroy, that we first lay well the plan for reconstruction." Let's not mash up before we have a plan to rebuild. A confirmed federalist, Pilgrim also published in every issue of the West Indian Crusader the motto of fellow Grenadian T.A. Marishall's call for a West Indies Federation, which was also published in The West Indian, which was a newspaper edited by Marichaud out of Grenada, which I got to edit the succeeding Free West Indian during the Revolution. But that motto read, and I quote, "that these West Indies, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth." The West Indian Crusader crusaded the causes of workers and so-called people of color at home and abroad, mainly defending the right of ordinary St. Lucians to an equal share of life on the island of their birth. But Pilgrim would soon start running into problems with the colonial system after his newspaper opposed the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy in 1935, daily reporting on the world's response to the atrocities committed against the Ethiopian people by Mussolini. The West Indian Crusader did play its role under Pilgrim to increase the consciousness and solidarity of St. Lucians with Africans across the world, and in particular on the continent. As George noted, nearly 50 years later, in 1984, in his editorial tribute to Pilgrim, and I quote here, excuse me, this thing just took a little trip ahead of me. You know, the technology does that to the best of us sometimes. Okay, I'm getting there. Yeah, but Pilgrim would soon start running into problems with the colonial system after his newspaper opposed the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy in 1935. As George noted nearly 50 years later in the editorial tribute to Pilgrim, and I quote, "In St. Lucia, with its massive Roman Catholic population, the clergy had an almost mesmeric hold on the minds of the largely illiterate population, but the ideas of Marcus Garvey had started to take root, and St. Lucia had already formed a branch of the United Negro Improvement Association, so there was already a nucleus of people like Pilgrim and George Cooper who formed a group named Friends of Ethiopia." The West Indian Crusader back then, which is 83 years ago today, also weekly provided a platform for progressive literati of the day to make those linkages with the global Negro improvement movement led by Marcus Garvey, to the extent that a mass meeting was held at the Clark's Theatre in Castries on the 7th of April 1936 to pass a resolution to be sent to the British government in connection with the Italo-Ethiopian War. Under Pilgrim, the West Indian Crusader increased the consciousness of Catholics here about the way the Vatican was supporting the slaughter of Ethiopians over a 7-month period, and that was not good news for the church and the colonial establishment. Pilgrim and the paper would soon start to pay the thankless price of political journalism that George wrote about. As George noted in his Pilgrim postscript, the Crusaders' campaign was effective, and both the Catholic Church and the establishment in St. Lucia started to bristle at the barbs of John Pilgrim. The Crusader had exposed and vehemently opposed the fact that Mussolini's bombs raining on Ethiopia had been blessed by the Pope. As a result, the church targeted Pilgrim for religious persecution and prosecution. And George recalled, and I quote, "One Roman Catholic priest took to the pulpit and instructed St. Lucians not to buy the West Indian Crusader as a form of economic boycott against Pilgrim and his kind." End of quote. And here we come to one account of George's flowery way with using bright and colorful language to brighten even the darkest images. Scripting how the colonial state was circling the wagons around Pilgrim and the West Indian Crusader, George drew the following landscape, and I quote, "The battle was on. The underground network of influence and pressure started to operate. Pilgrim was branded. Catholics were warned, Protestants alerted, pusillanimous professionals were checkmated, merchants were given the wink, and even the black man on the streets was subtly conditioned to think that Pilgrim was somehow beyond the pale of civilization and society. He, Pilgrim, was therefore sent to a kind of social Coventry." End of quote. George's Pilgrim eulogy noted the toll the pressure took on Pilgrim, a toll that George himself was also facing at the Crusader at the very same time. George pointed out that over the years it mattered little that Pilgrim had been a founder of the first indigenous bank, of the island's first trade union, of the Manufacturers Association, or that he was foremost in the Back to the Land campaign, or even that he had belonged to 3 Masonic lodges. According to the editorial, and I quote again, "All these mattered little in the face of the establishment's view that he, Pilgrim, was too independent, too fearless, too courageous, too outspoken, too irreverent, too black conscious, and therefore considered a threat to the established order in St. Lucia. The social and economic pressures took their toll on Pilgrim, according to George, but he soldiered on, trying to maintain his literary and journalistic standards and trying to shape the course of St. Lucia's development the best he could. By the 60s, the issues had become blurred and his vision impaired. A quarter century of vigorous and spirited championship of causes, political issues, and solid debates had enfeebled his crusading arm. The economic pressures made his independent survival in the thankless world of political journalism even more difficult. By then, in 1984, when Orwellian predictions by George's age-old namesake had not fructified, George had been at the helm of the paper for about 15 years. He had also been through the turbulent political process, from the Forum to the St. Lucia Labour Action Movement, SLAM, and from the St. Lucia Labour Party to the Progressive Labour Party. He'd also lost more elections than he'd won, and been more out of government than in. He'd spent more time breaking than building governments, but George's political leadership role hadn't dwindled, as the words flowing from his mouth and pen ensured that he remained more than a head above the rest of his fellow actors on the political stage. Indeed, George's pen was mightier than all their swords. By that time, at age 50, George also had sufficient reason to weigh the costs and benefits, the gains and losses of crusading for causes in what he had by then also come to see as a thankless world where people only want more and give less, and ingratitude had become a new norm. George noted that Pilgrim sold the West Indian Crusader to Vernon Cooper, the son of his friend George Cooper, in 1950, somewhat reluctantly, George noted, and Pilgrim proceeded to spend the rest of his life regretting that the paper had slipped into personality politics instead of the pursuit of ideas and principles. So Pilgrim sold the Crusader with regret. And according to George, Pilgrim couldn't resist the temptation to start afresh, so he published a second newspaper, The Standard. But as George also noted, his flame had quenched, and the crusading zeal had become reflective and nostalgic as the tempestuous 70s had no time for maudlin sentimentality. End of quote. After Pilgrim established the Standard but was unable to continue editing due to failing health, while lying on a bed at Victoria Hospital, he asked Timothy Alfred, a young and loyal servant and student at the newspaper, to take a message to George Odlum that he, Pilgrim, would like George to edit the Standard. George was still Executive Secretary of the West Indies Associated States and was both unable and unwilling to take on that particular task. Timothy let George know how disappointed old man Pilly would be, but George would invite Timothy himself to summon his own bravery, to recall all he had learned while working with Mr. Pilgrim, and, according to George, give it a go. Timothy Alfred recalls in his book, St. Lucia's Very Own, Volume 1, which was published in 2005, he said it was thanks to George's encouragement that he did not indeed summon the courage and confidence that he did indeed summon the courage and confidence, and that was how Tim the pressman and Tim the cub reporter also ended up as Tim the editor at the Standard, all to keep Mr. Pilgrim's flag flying at the Standard. Obviously, George the politician, Yeah, obviously, George the politician had kept his lens focused on the West Indian Crusader and the Standard later under Pilgrim, and in the process he continued to note the toll the thanklessness of the society had had and was still having on the old man in the twilight of his days. So George's editorial eulogy showed Pilgrim as, quote, an independent spirit who was critical but not iconoclastic. He took up the cudgels for the disadvantaged and fought his crusades with an urbane intensity. Perhaps our society might have been too self-righteous, too hypocritical, too bigoted to allow him the luxury of a different point of view. He was by no means a flaming radical, but a kind of a benign liberalism reminiscent of the Fabians in England, and an impish recklessness which recalled George Bernard Shaw. These final paragraphs captured George's observation of the effect of the social or the societal thanklessness on crusaders for causes who ran afoul of the establishment and lose their friends too in the process. Of Pilgrim's last days, George noted, and I quote, he spent his last decade in the cozy and humble retreat of his home at Latok, with all his slightly outdated printing presses stored in the basement of his home. He must have listened to the cacophony of presses in the quiet of his home, even when the machines were silent. Visitors were few, and the tacit ban of the establishment was never officially exited. Old Pilly coped with the isolation, understood the phenomenon. He had taken his stand and was willing to pay the price. He sat in his chair day by day for years and watched the fleeting pageant of the passing hour. Even his lodge brothers, who provided the mumbo-jumbo at his graveside, failed to visit while he was alive. And then came a special quote from Whence I Knoweth Not, in which George says, O life, I felt your sting. O grave, thou art a victory. Pilgrim, George's epitaph noted, had a rather longer time to muse on the folly of the human pageant and the cruelty of the society. And George finally concluded, when Pilgrim died 2 years ahead of his century, he had found a spiritual quiet in his new religion, the Church of Christ. Its members were his friends, and like Thomas A. Becket, he must have thought, had I but served my God with half the zeal I served my fellow men? But, George notes, perhaps there is no distinction. That was George about Pilgrim, the very first Crusader. You all with me? Yeah. All right, let's go to the second Crusaders now. Let's now look briefly at the second Crusaders, this time George the Second Crusader for causes, and the Second Crusader newspaper. So we're looking at George and the newspaper. The full story of how George got hold of the Crusader has never been told, at least not publicly. I will not pretend to know it, but I think I know enough to know that from what I know I can say I know whatever I know, however, George did not come by the Crusader alone. Before George, the Crusader had actually come twice, first under Pilgrim as the West Indian Crusader and under Cooper, and in both cases as the West Indian Crusader. But the real second coming was under George W. Odlum in 1970, when the paper returned to the crusading zeal that Pilgrim originally planted it with. Vernon Cooper, as a lawyer sufficiently learned in the business of family property ownership, did not just give the newspaper away to George for free. But from day one, George's fingerprints were all over the paper. Not that you'd ever see his name anywhere. George never put his name to an article, but you could read his mind through his clear fingerprints and hear his voice in his penmanship if you knew how to read the Crusader. By the time George took over the Crusader, he had long developed writing skills that equaled his oratorial and performing genius. He had long been writing and performing while studying the skills of the world's best writers, playwrights, and poets, and had already developed that ability to transmit local messages through their words. But George would also marry the words of Shakespeare and Shaw to the lyrics of Cécile Descartes, any of her songs with a ring of Ramopoli instrumentality in their commonality in equal ability to transmit messages in language, sound, and performance. George would often invoke Creole proverbs in his columns to translate the words of the feathered pens in the language of the market steps. That was George, the writer and publisher. Now, let's look at George, the wordsmith, the formidable forger of barbs by bards. And here we go to George the wordsmith. Think of a blacksmith. He forges the most out of the least to do the best, linking bits to pieces to make a perfect new whole. Likewise, the good writer who builds worlds of words from letters, always looking for the easiest way of linking the least letters to tell the most of a story. George was that way with words, a veritable, not literal, but literary wordsmith. Such was his way with diction and dictation that keen readers of his weekly editorials would find at least one word, nearly every week, that he or she will not have heard before and would most likely have been sent to the dictionary. I never tried to figure out whether George was just cutting intellectual style, as one friendly Rastaman with a refined intellect once described him to me, because I too sometimes had to consult MacDonald's or Collins, read a word or two. But George's grasp of the English language was so wide that his mastery at juggling words was evident every time he put pen to paper, whether for an editorial or for a serious comedic column. George was particularly skillful in forging big headlines from little words. He would first draw his headline on the top half of the first page in large block letters, then write the article below, and most times you could have counted on each Saturday's headline being one the government of the day would wish had never even made the light of day. So let's look at some of the main world of words products forged by George the wordsmith every week, all year round, at the Crusader. And let's start with George's editorials. George had an editorial pattern of dressing up and delivering messages in different linguistic and lyrical costumes. Invariably, his editorials and front page articles would be the sum total of his address on the market steps on a Friday night, just hours before Saturday Crusader would go to the press. Overtime wasn't a word known to us at the Crusader, so we would have to wait until whatever time the public meeting is over, and George would rush through the doors and quickly make that transition from a preaching politician to a political penman, pull a chair, sit at the nearest table, and write his related editorial and front page article. Back then, typewriters was a bourgeois luxury. But George was no typewriter man. He wrote with his pen, and on the first piece of blank paper he could get his hands on, be it newsprint, exercise book page, or on the back of 2 or 3 spoiled calendars that he picked up in the rubbish on the way inside. When George's editorial wasn't about a platform topic, it would be exposing some unpopular action or statement by the government of the day. But even if the pain of the struggling man came to the fore in George's editorials exposing government and ruling party excesses, he nonetheless took extreme pleasure in playing with words and crafting language in terms that made the reader both laugh and cry with equal measure and pleasure. It was said that a good diplomat has to have such a way with words that he or she should be able to tell you to go to hell in such a way that you would actually look forward to the trip. Well, if that is true, George proved it over and over again as an ambassador and as a foreign affairs minister. His language could be as sugary as cane juice or laced with coarse sea salt. So let's now look at how George exercised and balanced the various aspects of his dexterity as a writer every week in the Crusader. And we come here to quick quack. If you want to say that George was a man ahead of his time as a writer, then we could look at his relationship to and his use of mechanical economy of words to send out the loudest message. In one paragraph, through quick quack, he would capture an entire chapter of the political life of the past week. Quick quack was a single paragraph snippet preceded by a very short title in bold capital letters, a brief introductory teaser, a trailer if you want, of what is embedded. The paragraph would tell the story and end with the words quick quack, borrowed from a traditional local folklore by that name that plays on words to lead the participating listener to an obvious conclusion. So quick quack was a transformative narrative of politics sandwiched between aspects of traditional folklore seasoned and salted with a few loaded words with many meanings. Quick quack also had this before its time aspect to it, as it preceded by half a century the 140 character phenomenon we know today as Twitter. Twitter is actually today a today version of George's economy of words, rich in context and always pregnant with meaning. Quick quack had a way of getting the message across that touched, inspired, and eventually affected the interpretation of the reader regarding whatever the issue was. I will say that George sold his message weekly in quick quack more smoothly and effectively than Donald Trump does every morning on Twitter. You can always doubt Donald Trump, but you just couldn't disbelieve George, if only because you could never say he said what you understood him to say from what he wrote. Yes, George was that good. So you could imagine if George had a Twitter account and WhatsApp and Facebook. But let's get back to George's reality. And let's look at Cocky and Stocky. And I don't know if you could lift that. So, that's why I told him to wire me up, so I could just walk around and maybe go and touch people and show people what I want to show them. This here is the back page of the Crusader every Saturday. This is what it looked like, the back page. The last two things to be printed on the paper. The front page, which is the big headline, and the back page, Cocky and Stocky. And invariably, the back page would be linked to the front through Cocky and Stocky. So you read the headline, you read the editorial, you read quick quack, and when you want to get the real story to go and explain it to people, you read Cocky and Stocky. So let's look now at Cocky and Stocky and its own transformation as something that I really wish we could be able to go and see every weekend. A Cocky and Stocky today, interpreting the events of today. This column, Cocky and Stocky, has an interesting history because it was patterned on a Crusader column that John H. Pilgrim used to tell his tales and introduce topics from events at home and abroad. The Pilgrim version was called Finnegan and Cohen, who he described as, and I quote, two philosophers who meet regularly to discuss current events freely, frankly, and friendly, as reported in the Standard. Finnegan was a cynic and Cohen was a critic. The exchanges between them were between learned men of letters who understood political currents in Britain above all, and whose interpretations of events were within the confines of establishment thinking. By then, Pilgrim had been so bitten more than once that he'd forcibly become more than twice shy of providing any coverage of politics in the Standard that could even be slightly regarded as partisan. Such was his unilateral sense of self-censorship that Pilgrim would automatically refuse to publish any article in the Standard that anyone could be deemed political. But again, through Finnegan and Cohen, Pilgrim was able to safely put his thoughts in the mouths of invisible men who he had given life to on paper through his feathered pen, which was always mightier than any of his swords as a politician, a trade unionist, and a businessman. When it first started, Cocky and Stocky adopted the same style, as in the Crusader. It adopted the same style of two men of different partisan political perspectives, peacefully discussing the burning issues of the day, but in this case, two diehard supporters of the two major parties of the time. Cocky was a Flambeau, and Stocky was a Etoile. But unlike Finnegan and Cohen, Cocky and Stocky exchanged views in language that more grassroots readers would more easily understand. Another difference was that whereas Cocky and Stocky in the very first Crusader newspaper under Pilgrim and Cooper, and we're talking here about Finnegan and Cohen, they wore ties and often used big English political terms. But Cocky and Stocky in the second Crusader under George wore ordinary T-shirts, and they met every Friday night on the Castries Bridge. Cocky and Stocky was a classic feature of George's multifaceted ability to combine his writing, performance, and literary skills to convey messages through stories that all could relate to. So the scripted weekly scenario could very well have been a weekly Arts Guild production, if only George would give it that at the time. The weekly weekend discourse on the bridge would often be a blistering battle of babble that reflected the unflinching and relentless loyalty of each man to his party, to the extent that each would find the most ridiculous arguments to personally defend their party's position on the controversial political issue of the week. Invariably and understandably, Stocky would make more sense, or better nonsense, than Cocky, towing the official line of whatever political outfit George belonged to at the time of writing, and explaining it in a historical context based on the two having been a pair of old political gladiators on the same side in the Labour Party before the UWP was established in 1964. So Cocky and Stocky were both Labourites, but when the UWP came about, the two friends supported different parties now. So Cocky and Stocky was essential reading material every Saturday for an appreciation of or information about the burning political issues of the week, even though salted and seasoned in George's own image and likeness. But if Cocky and Stocky was an inheritance, historical circumstances would again force George to easily adjust the script and screenplay to suit the time. This time, around 1981, George had fallen out badly with his colleagues in the leadership of the Labour Party following the 1979 victory. Therefore, no longer could Cocky always be right or sound right. With George about to break up with the Labour Party to form his own party, the Progressive Labour Party, the adjusted screenplay introduced a new character on the bridge. Enter Staffy. The name of the column was changed to Cocky, Stocky, and that whole picture you see there was changed to what it is there now, where you see three fellas instead of two. It was Cocky, Stocky, but we later fixed the headline to reflect Staffy. But in the picture you'll see three fellas, right? And you'll look at the picture while I'm reading. The name of the column was changed to Cocky and Stocky and Staffy, and a new ink stamp, later that's what you called an ink stamp, later called a plate, and today you call it a template. That was drawn and created to reflect a new poster of three characters on the bridge, this time Staffy, unmistakably larger in size, with greater girth, and of course, more radical appearance, what we call trending today. That was what was trending in 1969-70. Here, George successfully combined his father's nickname, Staffy, with his trademark Mao-style cap and his bulging boudin, for this like character who would every weekend take over the political discussion and make interjections that demonstrated his literary and intellectual superiority, his grassroots philosophical outlook, and his more mature analysis level. So Stappy was the new star on the bridge, the new cowboy in town who would every week make Cocky and Stocky look and sound equally bad, just as Odlum would make the SLP and the UWP seem from PLP platforms. The same would happen again in the period leading to the 2001 general elections, when Staffy's guns were now turned on Kenny Anthony and the Labour Party administration as he prepared to join the alliance against another government that he had been part of. Staffy spelled out George's political narrative in the newly scripted column, but it never lost any of its original combination of humor and seriousness, with words scripted to visualize desired images through imagined performances of three men arguing ferociously until, mutually respectfully, in George's own true Oxfordian style, they would bid each other the best good evening before parting to head home to escape the same declining social conditions that they had been discussing and arguing over, with saucy insults and undisguised sarcasm interspersed therein. The next column we look at is briefly what the people say, and this was a weekly Vox Populi, Voice of the People, in which we would solicit and publish the views of the ordinary man and woman about the issues of the day or the week, but not necessarily every week, as that required someone going out into the street to solicit and write down those views. We didn't have tape recorders, far less cell phones in those days. So here too, while the views published were those truly expressed, we would, however, not seek responses from known UWPs. And if any slips through, well, with most times wage balance in the scheme of things, and we would probably just don't have space to put it in. And then there was my annual favorite, which I enjoyed doing whenever George was unable to do it. I used to like to do it so much. I used to ask him, George, you're not traveling for Christmas? It's called Santa's Mailbag. This was George's annual Christmas wish list, especially for people he disliked. He would ask Santa for the most imaginative gifts for every government official, from government to prime minister to each and every cabinet minister. Each requested gift a special creation just for that person. George would respectfully apologize to Santa for the trouble he would have to go through to get that special gift befitting each person. But he would also explain why that person deserves that gift, to help that person overcome the strictures of their political stupidity, or to reduce the weight of their burden on the society. So Santa's mailbag was always very full, fully loaded with the best of George's ability to write in ways that underwrite his own ability to write bad and not so nice things about you in such a nice way that you would even laugh at yourself until you realize you were laughing at yourself. That was the aspect of George, the weekly writer of stories and columns. Reading through each of the above columns after he hurriedly dropped off handwritten copies at the front desk of the Crusader on his way to somewhere else, I would sense George's troublesome happiness, scripting these paragraphs of verses in the solace of his boudoir or balcony, sewing the fine lines between the bold messages with an embroidery of flowing perfection. But just as he could crochet words with poetic perfection, George was equally able to stitch words and letters into weapons. On the warpath, his writing was testimony that, again, George's pen was most times mightier than his opponent's swords. And now we go to the scribblings about George's writings, what people had to say about George. And George, as you know, never wrote an autobiography. Instead, he weekly penned his political thoughts for eternity in Crusader editorials, a sizable number of which over time some close friends wisely decided to select, package, and publish for posterity in 3 of the 8 works I have mainly quoted from George's Food for Thought. But apart from the compilation of editorials, I will also share quotes from an anthology of poems in tribute to George, as well as some interesting local books, like I said, by mainly little-known local writers. One of the books was compiled while George was dying. The 3 were written before and 2 after George died, and 3 appeared after he departed to the great beyond. I will also share with you some words from George himself about his own destiny with death, and St. Lucia's destiny with the apocalypse horsemen. I will also quote from a brief talk to St. Lucians abroad by another homeboy St. Lucian man of letters about who George was and how best to understand and appreciate his legacy. Then I will share with you some recommendations that I will join the poet John Robert Lee in sharing with you tonight. Let's continue feasting on George's food for thought as we continue the journey into the wider literary world of Georgeville by George. The other one is Called at George, and this is a publication by Augustus Justin, the proprietor of the then lithographic press. And I must show you all these publications because I pulled them out of my library. And the one we're doing now is Called at George. And Called at George, printed and published in July 1979 by Lithographic Press. And this is a publication by Augustus Justin, the proprietor of the then Lithographic Press on Chaussee Road in Castries. It pulls together 14 Crusader editorials from 1975 to 1978. It was published ahead of the 2nd July 1979 general elections, which the SLP won by a landslide of 12 to 5, just 5 months after independence on February 2nd, 1979. In this useful booklet will be found George's position on socialism for St. Lucia in an article entitled Towards a Socialist State, as well as the following articles. All is fair in elections and war. Thou shalt not steal unless thou art hungry. The sin of wages. We know about the wages of sin. The sin of wages. The logic of violence. And also in this are some very interesting pictures. Can anybody remember this guy? Peter Josie. Back then. And there is one photograph here that I think is the one that George. Here you have George meeting the Queen as president of the union, the Bristol Students' Union. But I think this is the picture that George would have liked the most to let his Oxford people have seen. And that is a picture with him and farm workers after they had established the Farm and Farm Workers Union and they had been able to win a minimum wage for agricultural workers. That is the sort of picture George would have wanted to send back. One also needs to understand why Gus, as we call him, wrote that book. In the foreword, Gus would recall an incident when he landed on the Castries Wharf after returning home from studying in the UK. Y'all go like that. Gus had been greeted by a porter on the wharf who was an old friend who asked him, Hey, Gus, you come back for good? And still holding Gus's hand in welcome greeting, the friendly porter sighed and warned Gus, Man, this country hardy. It's not the same way you left it, huh? You have to be a crook, a foreigner, or a smart man to live in this country. Gus would admit that in just a few months after landing back home, he would get to understand what his friend meant. Because This was no longer home sweet home. It just wasn't easy for Gus to make a contribution. And as he put it, I am not a crook, I am a St. Lucian, and frankly, I'm not very smart. But Gus had one thing, faith, which he also saw in George and the Crusader. So Gus would write in the foreword to this book that he saw George as another man of that little extra faith. And he concluded that were it not for George's faith, the chances of a Labour government being in power today between 1979 and 1982 may not have been. And Gus highlighted the fact that although the paper was the voice of the struggling people and the Labour Party, it was more so the voice of George. He saw that as the main reason the paper's circulation had increased from about 300 when George took it over in 1970 to 8,000 after the Labour Party won the 1979 general elections. Gus would write too that despite the century-old established rival newspaper, the Voice of St. Lucia, calling itself the national newspaper of St. Lucia, as far as Gus was concerned, the Crusader can easily be described as the national paper of the country. I can say so because the Crusader is the only newspaper that a St. Lucian will tell you he reads from cover to cover. The editorials are lengthy most times, but the reader never misses it because they are some of the best editorials, possibly the finest in the Eastern, if not in the entire Caribbean. Gus attributed his deep trust in George's faith to the fact that, and I quote, "The Crusader and George have survived many a libel case, and on the political front, he has been tear-gassed and harassed more than any other politician in St. Lucia's history." As to the reason Gus selected and reproduced these 14 editorials, he explained it this way. For the benefit of the people of St. Lucia, the editorials reproduced here will help remind Mr. Odlum and his large following of the principles he stood for, be it in 1975 or in 1984. The big question is, why did Gus find it necessary at that time to remind George and his big following of the principles he stood of over the years? Gus did not provide the answer, but he did provide the foundation for people to be able to read George's mind on the issues of the day as George documented them by pen, on paper, in the Crusader. Today, 34 years after 1984, we can read those editorials and learn more about how George's mind worked back then vis-a-vis what he wrote, said, and did as a writer and politician for the rest of his 19 years on earth. Thank you, Gus. Vignettes was established in 1983, and this second book I will mention as a sampling of early editorials and articles from 1968 to 1983, and according to John Robert Lee, it contains reviews of theater and literature, as well as social commentary on everything from politics to superstition and eulogies. Now, I will not quote from this publication because I could not place my hands on it, and more so because everything I will have quoted tonight is from my own small library. The next publication to be quoted is called The Moral Agenda, and it was produced in 1994. This third significant collection of Crusader editorials by George was produced by his lifelong friend Cornell Baby Charles, the son of the late great St. Lucian business pioneer Sir John Quintin Charles, the person we refer to as JQ. More than 3 times longer than Called at George, this is a collection of 46 editorials and opinion pieces by George that John Robert Lee told St. Lucians in St. Croix 1 year after George died that he considers to be, according to Robert, some of George's most mature writing in literary style, logical development of discussion, and grasp of the issues before him. This collection contains more than just editorials, but also includes articles written by George in 1993, all of them, a full decade after the earlier Justin collection, and according to John Robert Lee again, and I quote, "It ranges from social and political issues to his justifiably well-respected obituaries of prominent St. Lucians. In this book, the complexities of St. Lucian society are woven together with fine argument, sharp, incisive analysis, and a perception that leaves opponents naked. Yet it is all done with a generosity of spirit, leaving room for a continuity of debate and friendship, even when he has had to be fierce in his exposure of self-centeredness, loose reasoning, and factual error." End of quote. The moral agenda starts with an editorial review of the year before entitled "Justice Took a Nosedive in 1992." And that editorial basically recalled various incidents of police brutality and judicial cover-up, police involvement in the drugs trade, and other related issues that propelled the need for national pursuit of a moral agenda in 1993 and thereafter. The 1992 general elections had again returned the UWP to office on the basis of what George would arguably describe in that opening editorial as, and I quote, "the incompetence and lack of credibility of the opposition party," end of quote. But George also knew that there were other more liquid forces at work during the campaign and on election day in 1992. And as he also noted a few lines later in that same editorial, that was also a time when, and quote, "one spokesman for the ruling party admitted publicly that drug barons were entitled to put their ill-gotten gains behind whichever party they fancy," end of quote. The moral agenda's wide editorial compass included more of George's sorts of titles like the following: "Geese and the Golden Eggs," "A Conscious Pilot," "The Choleric and the Cleric." Papa, you'll recall that one. "Joking with Gender," "Beware of Gift-Bearing Greeks," "Slipping into Revolt on a Banana Skin," "The New Banana Boat Song," "Bananas and the Political Agenda." Also included are "The Farmer's Dilemma," "Heads Win, Tails Lose," "Our Land, Our People, Our Plight," and "Who Will Be the Founding Fathers for the New Frontier." The reproductions in this volume also include two of George's other annual writing features I mentioned earlier, May Day Muses and National Day Reflections, each in their own way summing up George's assessment of the highlights, George's assessment of the highlights of the state of the political struggle on the workers' front at each May Day. That was in May Day Muses. And in the one entitled National Day Reflections, he would reflect on the national state of play every December 13 as the island continued, and shamefully does until now, is celebrating as a national day, a date that has absolutely no history or historical root in St. Lucia's history. George also wrote political manifestos, offered ideas on what is to be done and where to begin. He wrote open letters to the Prime Minister, but all from the platform of the Crusader, which was the equivalent back then of what would today have been George Odlum's Facebook page, alongside his website and Twitter account, all in one. And I will share with you now two manifestos for change that George wrote that had very serious consequences and effects on his life and on how the struggle continued at the time. Let me offer two examples of non-editorials in this publication, this particular publication, that were meant to have deeper political impact. In 1993, George had been through the electoral struggle of the period from 1974 to 1979, which ended in the all-round losses in 1982 general elections. Following that, he'd been through a decade of 1982 to 1992, developing the PLP as a third force that became the second dominant political force during that period, mainly on account of George's mobilization skills and the more permanent postings every weekend in the Crusader. The drug trade, not yet the cocaine menace it would later become, had seen the youth, in George's eyes, fall victim of the money and the bling that went with the new style. And George eventually would accuse the UWP in one editorial of using shabaranks and blockos unashamedly to mesmerize our people. I repeat, using shabaranks and blockos unashamedly to mesmerize our people, end of quote. George stubbornly refused to accept the turn of the new leaf that came with the cultural revolution that swept across the Caribbean by the rise of Bob Marley and the Wailers, reggae music, and the Rastafarian movement. He totally embraced the establishment's view of marijuana and only saw it as a dangerous drug that could ruin young people's lives. He totally rejected use of marijuana as a recreational drug, as did any argument about its medicinal properties, even as advocated by wider sections of the society not interested or involved in the trafficking and other like aspects that eventually made marijuana illegal under the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1976. George returned in 1993 to the same position he adopted at the Victoria Park or Marshall Grounds after the SLP's 1979 victory. He declared war in 1993 on marijuana. Back in 1979, George had told Rastafarians and other young supporters who felt sufficiently freed up under Labour to light up at the SLP's victory rally that they should think again, because marijuana will not be tolerated by a new administration, at least not under his watch. Indeed, that same anti-marijuana agenda would still occupy George's urgent attention 12 years later. Pushed by mitigating factors such as age, George was 59 in 1993, having scored only 2 wins in 1979 and 97 out of 7 elections between 1974 and 97, and the PLP not having mustered the level of electoral support to win more than just 1 seat, that of his brother John, and also pushed by the fact that he would most likely have to live under John Compton and the UWP for another 5 years up to the age of 64 at the most. George's approach to Compton would undergo a fundamental and significant change in 1993, from confrontation to cooperation. Egged by less radical schoolboy and college friends of the bourgeoisie of the day who were running their parents' companies and businesses in town at the time, George also accepted their view that he needed to be more positive in his criticism and offer ideas to the government that would achieve the things that he wanted to see. They would tell him, it doesn't matter if you like St. Lucia, whether it's you or the government, do it. Give the government ideas, let him do it, and you could say it's I that tell them what to do. George's schoolmates convinced him that from 1974 to 1992, a full 18 years, he had pursued the elusive dream of leading St. Lucia, and perhaps he should now shift gear. He'd been a cabinet minister twice, and each time he'd gotten into trouble with the respective prime ministers, first Alan Louisi and then Kenny Anthony. What might have been the first public evidence of this new trend was publication in the Crusader in 1993 of a 15-point plan to stop the rot. Now, there is no date in the copy reproduced inside here, but it is number 25 in the list of 46 editorials that are reproduced in the moral agenda. And in the opening paragraph of the 15-point plan, George stated, and I quote, Today, the Crusader sets out a 15-point plan to stop the rot. That is by no means an exhaustive or definitive plan, but it is an attempt to start the dialogue on rehabilitation with a view to devising an effective plan of action. Because of what I indicated earlier about George's personal position on marijuana, it would not surprise you that action point number 1 in the 15-point plan would be the following, and I quote, designate the areas of Marchand, Wilton's Yard, Conway, and Fuasho as danger areas requiring non-stop surveillance by armed police. There should be a continuous search for arms and drugs by the police in collaboration with leaders in the communities and persons desirous of seeing a new order in the area. End of quote. That was recommendation number 1. In reality, though, George's action plan was, in full effect, a manifesto against marijuana, as 10 of his 15 recommendations mentioned the word drugs. 1 proposed encouraging students and teachers to spy and report on marijuana users at school, at home, and assigning, quote unquote, the by then dreaded Special Services Unit, the SSU, with, according to George, helicopter facilities to intensify the search for marijuana fields island-wide with a view to destroying all fields discovered. End of quote. Another recommendation was to allocate any monies seized or properties confiscated in the drugs trade to finance a youth skills training program. By then it had become quite clear to the majority of the rebel youth population in the ghetto areas identified in the first recommendation, and indeed around the island, that marijuana under George would get the same response from the state as under succeeding Compton-led administrations. The police would still be able to search and arrest and jail young people for having a spliff or smoking a joint, while the big, real, and known criminal operators benefiting from treating marijuana as a business would still get away with the very apparent protection of certain lawmen and immunity from prosecution. Just like under the UWP, here was George not only also recommending keeping the SSU at the head of the fight against marijuana, but also recommending that the SSU be made independently airborne, which would have introduced, in essence, an airborne wing of the local police force, even though only outfitted to identify and destroy marijuana fields. It is impossible to tell exactly what effect George's uncompromising position against marijuana may have had in influencing the youth vote after 1979 or in the 4 elections thereafter. But what is clear is that George's 15-point plan was never considered by Compton. The ghettos were never converted to permanent armed police occupation, and the SSU never got the helicopter. The second sign of a changed or changing George would come not too long later. Again, there is no date, but at number 31 on page 44 in the moral agenda, George would again pen an open document with Sir John Compton in mind, this time an open letter to the Prime Minister. This open letter not only follows closely on the heel of the 15-point plan, but there's another thing to notice, and that is how George went out of his way to ensure that Sir John read that open letter to him. George had a watertight plan that he openly outlined in the first paragraph of the letter, the published letter, and it read, I followed. Dear Mr. Prime Minister, I am aware that you are not kindly disposed to reading the newspapers, but I am depending on the peculiar skills of your personal assistant to bring this open letter to your attention. So you can imagine if the man didn't read that. You don't know, where was that personal assistant? His name was John Bristol. The personal assistant being referred to was John Bristol, who would have been aware of the letter's importance and ensured Sir John would not only receive, but also know its contents. George, in that open letter, brought Sir John back to the pre-independent colonial decade of 1964 to 1974, when there was virtually no parliamentary opposition to the government. He explained, that is George explained his role in the period 1974 to 1979, when the SLP won, and his disappointments over what led to the fall of the SLP government in 1982. George maintained that he was right to have described particular members of the SLP who opposed him as gargoyles. And he would explain that while the fall of the government was basically the doing of the ruling party itself, I quote, "Our revolutionary colleagues in Grenada would remind us all the time that nobody gives up state power." End of quote. But George's position remained that despite the actions he and others took had resulted in the UWP remaining in office with the Labour in opposition in the wilderness for 10 years, George described it as a blow was struck for integrity, honesty, and decency as obvious qualities in any new order. After making his case to Sir John, in the open letter to Sir John, George ended it this way, and I quote, "What I'm trying to say to you is that the whole cycle of demoralization and corruption is here again. Exactly like the 70s. I see in government now the same things which caused me to submit my resignation in the 80s. I see the same diffidence and hesitation which I saw in the leadership of the Labour Party when it came to dealing with official corruption." Then George would go on to tell Sir John, "It would be an awful pity and a waste if you compromised your record of infrastructural development spanning 40 years of service by refusing to act promptly to stem the decay and leave a legacy of uprightness and integrity for the next generation to follow." And the final paragraph in that telling letter would read, and I quote, "I trust you will see these perceptions in the spirit in which they are offered and stop the ship of state from careening on the rocks of anarchy and chaos." And the letter was signed, "Yours truly, George Odlum, the Crusader." Not PLP leader, not anything else, just George Odlum, the Crusader. And that's once again George explaining to you the importance of the Crusader, the role of what his opponents saw as a newspaper or a rag, but it was a tool, an effective instrument of the struggle. By then, I had already left my position as editor of the Star for the second time and accepted an invitation from the president of Guyana, Dr. Chedi Jagan, to come help and reorganize the party and state media within the context of the new changes being introduced by the PPP government in Guyana after 28 years in opposition. I used to receive the Crusader in the mail every weekend, and when I read this open letter, I remember telling President Jagan that George is singing a new swan song we'd never heard before. Chedi read the letter and told me quite seriously, "Comrade, the only thing George didn't say in this letter to Compton is, 'Let's dance.'" But the invitation was there. Don't be surprised by anything more new you might hear. We've been through that in Guyana. I didn't have to wait long. The next thing I heard was that George had agreed to be St. Lucia's ambassador to the United Nations, and yes, under a UWP administration led by Sir John. Sir John and George Odlum demonstrated over time that they both had that way of doing the politically unexpected to keep each other confused and observers divided. By that time, George and his political twin, Peter Josie, had crossed swords, and Josie too would be appointed to a UWP cabinet, Minister of Bananas, but only after removing a red Labour Party t-shirt, rolling it up into a ball, and kicking it into a crowd from a UWP platform in Vieux-Fort. Back then too, the wily Compton would also ensure that every graduate who returned from Cuba to St. Lucia that had been sent by the WRM or by the Labour Party or by George Odlum, Compton would ensure that each and every one of them was given a permanent government job, if only to ensure they could never engage in political activity against him as public servants. But back to George. You will come to your own conclusions about George courting Compton in public, but please note that both the 15-point plan and the open letter to the Prime Minister were both published in the Crusader. They were not private correspondences. They were published in the Crusader, George's private public platform, his then version of a Facebook and website wrapped in one. And then there was Roseau Valley and other poems for brother George Odlum. In 2003, published it when I talked about, I earlier talked about a publication that was being put together while George was dying. This was it. This fourth publication in tribute to George is an anthology published by the Jubilee Trust Fund in 2003. And again, I want to acknowledge Papa's presence and his role, along with others in the Jubilee Trust Fund, in putting together this first very fitting tribute to George so soon after his death. The fourth publication in tribute to George is an anthology published by the Jubilee Trust Fund in 2003. And George was by then terminally ill, and the fund's members had agreed to dedicate this anthology to his life. Sadly, George would die before the book was published. But when it was, the fund was able to dedicate it to his life on earth after 69 years, 1939 to 2003. The anthology comprises the works of over 40 St. Lucian and Caribbean poets and writers, novelists and songwriters, including Edward Bore, Jamaica, Camo Braffett and George Lamming, Barbados, Martin Carter and Michael Gilks of Guyana. The list of local names includes everyone from Derek Walcott to Harold Simmons, and it is just too long to name each in full. Suffice to say that here again, George was serenaded by writers of every political stripe and color, but not as much for his politics as for his brilliance as a writer and talker, a mover and shaker of various proportions who everyone admired, but not everyone trusted. This book, is indeed a rare treasure. In the foreword, Monsignor Dr. Patrick Anthony notes the following. This compilation contains poems in St. Lucian Creole, Standard English, and Caribbean vernacular or nation language. The reader will find lyrics of traditional songs popular during the George Odlum era in St. Lucia. Uniquely, this book is also a collector's item of rare paintings and photographs by people like Harold Simmons and Leo Spa St. Helene. Overall, the poems and art become a mirror that reflects the breadth of Odlum's life and that of his peers. The collection is structured like a play with a musical prologue and a fitting epilogue by singer and songwriter Charles Cadet, all dedicated to a man of words and action who was also a talented creative artist. If one finds in this anthology echoes of George's story, a glimpse of contemporary St. Lucian history, we will be all pleased. End of quote. Papa, I'm sure everybody who reads it and gets a look at it will be all pleased, as I was. Roseau Valley, like I said, was a tribute George would have been proud of. Its name deriving from his service in the Roseau Valley, along with others, to organize banana farmers and agricultural workers to struggle for better wages and working conditions and to seek better returns from banana exports. The next book I will quote, St. Lucia's very own, It's All in Me, Volume 1. And this is published by Timothy Alfred, who is an award-winning bartender with a long history at the Rex St. Lucian Hotel. But as far back as 1968, he showed a keen interest in writing, and after he joined John H. Pilgrim at the Standard, he took a keen interest in covering live local talent shows, and in 1970, he was encouraged to keep writing by the Barbadian writer and entertainment promoter Al Gilks. And Timothy Alfred and Al Gilks, I am sure, are both well known by another star of that period who is here this evening, and I speak of Dave Samuels. By 1974, Timothy would share his training at the Standard with the Crusader, during which time George and his father Staffy would both encourage him to do what he loved best. Tim penned tributes to Odlum and Pilgrim, and in this he has two tributes, one to George, and it's interesting, these two tributes. The one George wrote of Pilgrim, and another one written to George. So they are both in here, and you will find it here. So we have already been through what George had to say about Pilgrim the year he died, and George revisited Pilgrim to put together the new Crusader. So now we also look at another publication, My Story, Your Voice. My copy remained in the car, Dave, but if you have a copy, you could pass it on. You have a copy with you here? Yes. My Story, Your Voice by David Samuels. It was published in 2018, earlier this year, and in this local publication, published just the other day, the broadcaster, writer, dedicates an entire 15-page chapter to Dave's own recollections of encounters with George over decades. And there are just two encounters from there that I will share with you, after pointing out that as far as Dave was concerned, George wrote with such depth and titillated your thinking in such a manner not many others could. His biting and thought-provoking editorials, the quick-quack and cocky and stocky columns were a must-read, and we are all poorer for the void of his passing, the void his passing has created, not only politically, but journalistically. And Dave recalled the chilly feeling that he got when he genuinely offered George some grassroots political advice by suggesting, and it's all in the book, is the book there yet? And it's all in the book. Dave recalled the chilly feeling he got when he genuinely offered George some grassroots political advice by suggesting that he, George, should aim to be a politician like George William Mallet, the deputy leader of the UWP and Compton's right man, who attended everything held in his constituency and made himself so present and popular that he never lost a general election between 1958 and 1996, a full 38 years. So as Dave recalled, George heard none of the good reasons that he, Dave, had offered as to why a politician in elective politics should work towards being as re-electable as Mallet, even though for other reasons. All George heard Dave say was summarized in characteristic, brutal George brevity as he watched Dave in his two eyes and said, "Dave, so you want me to be a Mallet, eh?" Just by looking at the way George said it and looked at him, according to Dave, I said no more on that issue. And then there was that other time in 1993 when Sir John Compton, perhaps in response to the earlier recalled and quite appealing open letter to the Prime Minister that George had published in the Crusader, Compton had offered George the position of St. Lucia's ambassador to the United Nations. By Dave's recollection, Compton explained that he was offering George the job because, according to Compton, and I quote, "A man of such immense talent and ability should not be wasting his time in St. Lucia." So he was offering him the opportunity to put his skills to use for the benefit of all in the nation. And Dave recalls being asked by George for his opinion. And according to Dave, and I quote, "I recall telling him how thrilled and happy I was for him, but I wondered whether it wasn't a strategic move by Compton to get him out of the way." George confirmed that he'd thought about that as well, but I countered, all things aside, George, go for it. So George would eventually spend 2 years at the United Nations under UWP administration until he decided to dump the delicate diplomatic job after scaling the fence as an ambassador to join the protesters in Seattle against the World Trade Organization and return to St. Lucia to challenge the then UWP leader, Vaughan Lewis, who Sir John had selected as his leader. But then Dave would also apparently have taught George a third lesson, but which George learned. And Dave would recall that he had learned a lesson that he had so coldly rejected before, and that is that he had to try to personally convince people why they should vote for him. I don't think anybody could say they ever heard George go and ask somebody to vote for him. George refused. He absolutely refused to go door to door and constituency meeting. George ain't doing that. So Dave recalls in a vivid account, I recall my mother calling me at work during the Castries Central by-election campaign and announcing excitedly, Dave, you'd never guess who just came today to see me and asked me to support him in the upcoming election. I said to her, who? And she said, Odlum. 5 years later, George would again walk through what he has often described as the revolving door of politics and tag along again with the UWP in the formation of the alliance in 2001 along with Dr. Morella Joseph to challenge the Kenny Anthony administration. But we would move on, and I will fast forward to the tribute by Keith Weeks to George, and he separately being quoted. The reason I'm separately quoting Keith Weeks is because he was a fellow Arts Guild performer and a lifelong close friend of George. Again found in Timothy Alfred's collection, the former Anglican school principal and chairman of the Public Service Commission described George as, and I quote, a colossus bestriding the politics of St. Lucia for over 3 decades. Weeks noted that his inordinate desire to bring all the political institutions together brought him more pain than pleasure. He was the epitome of articulation. His speeches were always plain and straight, sometimes pungent, enriched by suitable quotations from Shakespeare. There is no doubt he was a student of the man himself. Weeks saw George had the talent of a great teacher, the general public, his classroom. He also recalled George's contribution to the creation of better citizens by leading the functional literacy classes at the Methodist Primary School in the early 60s. But Mr. Weeks would reveal in his brief memorial epitaph that his friend George gave unstintingly of his knowledge, unparalleled experience in politics, the arts, sports, and community development, and concluded that the depth of his knowledge of the theater has no match among the artists of today. Through the years of trials and tribulations that have beset him in the political and social world, Brother George has made the most substantial contribution that cannot be erased. According to Weeks, George Odlum said that he had a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, but he was not going into the dusk, but he will rage into the passing of the night. Whatever that meant, Weeks would add, we thank God that he died quietly with his family and friends around him. But what did George himself think about death, apart from Weeks? Apart from Weeks's undated quote about what George wrote about the rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, George also gave life to the subject of death in an editorial in the Moral Agenda called The Grim Reaper. George had great respect for St. Lucians, and this is the final part. George had great respect for St. Lucians who had achieved. He believed strongly that life on earth was also about what legacy you will leave when you move on. People actually looked forward to George's eulogies in the Crusader, and he found himself in 1993 writing memorial eulogies to Sir J.Q. Charles and Sir Alan Lewis. Buried, but thankfully not too deeply, in the Moral Agenda are two such pieces: In Memoriam, Sir John Quentin Charles, and Farewell, Sir Alan. The tribute to J.Q. Charles chronicled the local business giant's rise to fame and fortune from the time he purchased the entire Shock estate in the 1940s for £8,000 sterling, to the time he implanted himself into the local plantocracy by securing an overseas contract for cocoa and ended up buying all the local cocoa available at a price the planters just couldn't resist. It recalled that by the time JQ backed the formation of the island's first indigenous bank, the St. Lucia Cooperative Bank in 1938, JQ Charles was only 30 years old. It also noted that JQ's success was largely based on his self-reliance and modesty, and the fact that, according to George, JQ marched to the beat of his own drum and felt that the rest of the world was simply out of step. End of quote. The tribute to Sir Alan drew on the fact that while Sir Alan's brother Sir Arthur had scaled the citadels of university education in Great Britain, Alan had done the same, but from the private study of his own home, right here, never having left the soil to study, and at one time even scoring the highest pass mark in the entire British Commonwealth in a law exam that he wrote from home. George's documentation of the lives of those two great St. Lucians tell a lot about his commitment to ensuring that we ever appreciate and value the contributions of great St. Lucians, irrespective of which parties they supported or whether they lived in St. Lucia. George would take his crusading battles to the doorsteps and the altar of any church, delving into the philosophical influences of doctrinal Protestantism and Catholic religious teachings on St. Lucians by looking at the religious affiliations of J.Q. Charles and the two Lewises. George came to some conclusions that did not go down well with Parry Husbands, the then Attorney General, and a veritable Catholic Poto l'Église. Parry, the legal luminary, published in The Voice what was intended to be a doctrinal Catholic rebuttal to George in The Voice newspaper, trying to show how wrong George was in his own interpretation of aspects of Catholic doctrine. George responded with an editorial entitled Parrying for Catholicism, in which he donned all his gladiatorial debating weapons and skill to prove Parry was just, like the telling headline said, parrying for Catholicism. But immediately after writing those two editorials, according to the sequence in which they are printed, George came up with an editorial entitled Horseman Pass By. And here George takes the quote from the gravestone of the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats. And that quote says, "Cast a cold eye on life, O death, horseman, pass by." And George makes the point that the apocalypse horsemen have called on the doors of many distinguished sons of St. Lucia, teasing us into thought about the nature of life, the logic of death, and the quality of the footprint that one leaves in the fickle sands of time. After looking at what he regarded as a sorry lack of appreciation of the very large footprints of Sir Arthur and Sir Alan in St. Lucia's fickle sands of time, George admonished St. Lucians not to measure the value of one's greatness or goodness by what it represents at home, but by what it is in the global community. George the Wordsmith then quoted Wordsworth to warn us to avoid, and I quote, "feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no light or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love." And after warning too against confusing goodness with greatness, and recalling that Yeats had prescribed at his own command before death that the words of "horseman pass by" be inscribed on his tombstone, George ended his signal to the horseman to keep on riding with the relevant warning to us to always remember, never forget, and again I quote George here, "For when the last great scorer comes to write against your name, he will not ask who lost or won, but how you played the game." Conclusions, and now for my conclusions. The George Odlum Remembrance Celebration Committee started this year with a statement on January 28th, 2018 by its chairman, Jerry E.M. George, pointing out, among many other things, that the annual memorial lecture is aimed at exploring all aspects of the life and contribution of the man called Brother George. He acknowledged that the man was, and I quote, "a multi-sided and multinational man who raised consciousness of generations at home while championing the causes of small states internationally, at the same time being both heralded and reviled at home by those who valued his contribution and those who wished his father and mother never met." That last part is me, Jerry won't put that kind of thing in his things. As Jerry correctly noted in his statement published in Dave's book, to close the chapter about George, how George was seen depends on who you ask. How George was seen depends on who you ask. I have not here tried to muddy or perfume George's image or character, but instead shared with you my own perspectives on a man whose words, spoken and written, had a significant influence on how I would speak and write for the rest of my life after working alongside him twice over 10 years at the Crusader. And that thing coming in my throat there. George never sat me down to teach me a lesson, but I learned everything I could from him at the start of my lifelong career as a reporter and as a journalist, as a chronicler and a scribbler at home and abroad. We had our deep ideological and other differences over strategic and tactical political issues. There were times our differences couldn't have been deeper, but never, ever did we allow them to derail us from pursuing our respective political paths and the common Crusader path at the same time. I do hope I have done justice to George's legacy as a writer, as the bard that he was, the invincible word lord that he proved to be. And now for my recommendations. And here I return to John Robert Lees in his brief 8-page talk in St. Croix, in which he offers his own recommendations on what is to be done to understand George's legacy and where to begin. Robert outlined a list of 7 recommendations that I also support, and they are as follows. And I would like you to bear them in mind and note them if you can, because they will, I am sure, at some point be raised. 1, Jerry called for publication of a collection of George Odlum's writing in separate volumes from 1970 to 2003. And I would say let's go back to 1968 because we have the vignettes. So, recommendation number 1, a collection of George Odlum's writing in separate volumes from 1968 to 2003. Number 2, reissuing of the 3 collections already identified, the vignettes, Called at George, and the Moral Agenda. Number 3, an annual George Odlum lecture that is already happening. Remember, Jerry called for these things, Robert called for these things 1 year after George died. Establishment of a George Odlum Foundation. He also called for the George Odlum, called that the stadium in Viewport be named after George. And number 6, working with the Jubilee Trust Fund to keep George's memory alive beyond publication of Roseau Valley. And his last, number 7, was continuing activation of the George Odlum Grant for Creative Artists, which comes from the funds that the Jubilee Trust Funds gathers from sale of Roseau Valley. I totally support these 7 recommendations from Robert Lee, and here I will add my list. And number 8, the formal launching of the George Odlum Remembrance Celebration Committee. I think Jerry and these guys have been working loosely, just getting together every year like Carnival. You need to formally launch and work between these celebrations so that we can have a continuous level of preparation. Publication of all what others have written about George, everything that we could find. Recording, publication, production, and circulation of each of the previous 3 annual George Odlum Memorial Lectures. For a project to build a Crusader library with every copy of the Crusader that we could find. If it exists, let's put it together where people could have access to it. And we could upload it and do all those things that make it so easy to have it at your fingerprints. Establishment of a George Odlum Scholarship in politics, economics, philosophy, history, the arts, or journalism, either or any of these. Establishment of a George Odlum Institute for Political Education. Every one of the writers in those books have talked about the contribution George made to the political education of generations of St. Lucians. That legacy is worth continuing so that young people who want to go into elections would know that you don't have to just join a SLP or UWP support group. There's this institute that will show you what politics is all about, why you must know what the Constitution is, what are the rules, what's the difference between being a minister and an MP, etc., etc. That's the kind of political education institute I'm talking about. Open a bookshop selling all things George, online, on the ground, anywhere, anyhow, all how. And finally, I'm sure you would support me, and if you do, I'd like you to signal that. Number 15, the nomination of a posthumous national award for George Odlum. I think
in his honor somewhere.
The stadium, whose name has changed to the St. Jude Hospital. I think Robert's 7 suggestions and my 8 can make enough of a start by way of recommendations. As with everything else, it all depends on our actions. So, I end where I started. I never attended university, but you have turned me into a lecturer. In the process of writing this speech, I came across so much and wanted to say so much that I ended up writing a book, out of which I have extracted what you want to call what you just heard. I tried to present George, of George, and by George. I hope I did. At this point, all I have to say is, let's call that George.